Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and this afternoon I thought I would do a social commentary video for you guys because, I had someone raise in the comments a point the other day that one of the biggest things that professional bodybuilding does, and if I recall this particular individual, if I recall it is a self-admitted modestly enhanced lifter, is that it actually really blurs the lines and creates an enormous amount of confusion to the average person out there and even the average lifter as to what someone actually looks like who's natural versus who isn't. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling at my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And the reason it does that is because when you start looking at pro bodybuilding, the ridiculousness of it is that no one at that level is there who isn't not only extremely genetically gifted, but generally who isn't abusing mind-boggling amount of substances. And that's kind of the problem with the standard that it sets, right? It creates an interesting situation because you get people who will see someone my age, any of us who admit we're on TRT, for example, and go, well, if you're on TRT, why don't you look like a pro bodybuilder? And to anyone who knows anything, that statement itself should sound so ludicrous that they're probably laughing. Like, you would have to be profoundly ignorant to make such an absurd statement, right? But people say things like that and legitimately mean it. So the problem is that they are profoundly ignorant, aren't they? Obviously they are, or people wouldn't say silly stuff like that. But that's the situation we're dealing with. And, I believe it was, who was it the other day? Was it Jeff Nippard when we were discussing the whole fake natty thing? If he was talking about the scale of people who are obviously natural versus people who are obviously enhanced, and he had to use the example of someone who's obviously enhanced as Ronnie Coleman, and it's like, how ridiculous of an example does that need to be? I mean, do we need to be anywhere near that level to say that a person is obviously on gear? And that's how crazy it is that someone like him with a biochemistry background, who has been training for many, many years, been around all sorts of competitive bodybuilding, would actually even use that example and not use other much, much, much more modestly enhanced examples who are still obviously on. Do you guys see the problem with that? That's literally like saying, yeah, I mean, someone is obviously well off financially, right? Someone is obviously well off financially if they have a Lear jet, a mansion, and an extra summer home. It's like, such a statement is so ludicrous that that's almost what we're talking about here in the lifting world. That is what we're talking about, it being that ludicrous of a statement. Because you would look at that and say, okay, that's true, but does a person really need a Lear jet and a $5 million mansion for you to recognize that they're financially well off? I mean, realistically speaking, if I see any person who owns their own home and drives a Corvette and it can afford a nice couple of suits, they're probably decently well off financially, aren't they? Right? By most standards, that person is probably, I bet you, in the top 5 to 10% economically of their area. They're not working class, that's for sure. But that's how big of a jump that it seems that people need to be at. Before people will say someone, or what they visualize someone to look like who's on gear, who's on stuff, they think of a pro bodybuilder. That's the illusion and the silliness that pro bodybuilding has created, to the point to where people don't even recognize a user in general, because that's now the standard in their mind. I mean, that is as extreme as talking about how financially well off you are, because there's a sliding scale, just like there's a sliding scale of use. But then you look at, let's talk about what we talked about the other day. Dallas McCarver's blood work on his autopsy. His blood work suggested that he uses at least 10,000 milligrams of testosterone a week. That's what his blood work suggested. Again, someone I know personally, who knew him personally, who is a coach, had told me after the death, yeah, he said 18 to 20 units of growth hormone a day. I mean, people need to think about the insanity of those quantities. All right. In other words, this guy was using 10 times as much stuff as the 10 probably biggest guys at your gym. Probably at your gym, you look around and you know who the juice heads are, right? You know the guys who are the juice heads. You could probably take the 10 biggest guys at your gym and he had everything that they used combined into one person. That's what that basically means. All right, so if you want a perspective, he was putting at least 10 times the amount of stuff into his body than the guy at your gym who you think of as the big roid head. 10 times. So he had 10 of that guy all at one time. Do we understand the scale of that? So then that's now the standard that you need. I mean, and again, like I said before, look at Jerry Ward. We had 2 grams, right? Admitted 2 grams plus HGH growth hormone, less than what Dallas was allegedly using. But you even compare that with Rich Piana, you know, the 4.5 grams, all the other stuff he was on, but 4.5 grams a week, right? You compare that with even what Jerry Ward was on, and you know what? Jerry Ward was still on what I would count as a lot of stuff. It's like less than half of what Rich Piana used in the last cycle he did before he died. And you know what? Remember when I made the video analyzing that? What were people saying? I don't know. I know guys who use this sort of stuff. From a serious competitive bodybuilding perspective, what Rich is doing isn't really that extreme. There are guys out there who I know. There are people saying in the comments, I've known of guys who use a bit more than that. That's not even unusual. You go read on forums, there are guys using that much or more. Right? They're out there. So here's the problem. Look at the amount of stuff these guys are using, and then that's obviously what a guy looks like who's using. So that means that everyone who is carrying 20 pounds less muscle and is still on stuff and might even be using abuse amounts gets a free pass, because no one recognizes, since that's the standard, then everyone else, the overwhelming vast majority of people who are still not natty, get a free pass. Because here's the thing, the average guy who uses, you wouldn't know when you look at him. Right? The average guy who uses, you would know when you look at him. Plenty of the average guys who use don't even look as good from the perspective of a physique, don't even always look as good as the average fitness YouTuber does. Right? And what you usually find, you can tell sometimes of just the way that a person trains versus time they're training. For example, I know of guys who do get accused of being fake natties because of the look that they have, the size that they carry, who are very genetically gifted. You can tell by looking at them, who have 15 or 20 years of very, very hard training experience. All right? And by some standard, someone will look at them who is educated on use and say, well, they might be on. They look a little bit. I mean, the amount of size, the amount of leanness they do carry at that size, you know, that guy's a peeled 185 pounds at 5'11", 5'10", but, you know, well below 10% body fat. I mean, he's getting questionable, because that is questionable. Because if that person didn't have 15 years of hard training and good genetics and didn't do really heavy-ass barbell lifts all the time, they would need to be on stuff to be where they are. You see the difference? So when you see a guy who looks like that guy, like you see the guys like that. Take my bro Nico Ella. All right, take him for example. Guy has 20 years of lifting experience, focuses very heavy on the big barbell movements. He believes he lives and dies by them. You know, he's a 500-pound high bar squatter. Right, I've seen him do 6-7 reps of 405, ass to grass high bar. Guy deadlifts over 600 pounds, benches 315 for like 6 or 7 reps. Been training hard for 20 years. 20 years of hard training. But when he cuts up, the guy's in the 180s. The guy drops down into the 180s when he gets peeled. You know, you would look at that guy and a lot of people would say, okay, maybe he's on, until you look at his training history and say, okay, he's had 20 years to build this. He's been training since he was a teenager. He's been busting his ass for 20 years, and he trains pretty hard. He's been doing it for 20 years. He lists some good numbers. Maybe you would look at this, okay, it's possible. But by that same token, if you had someone who looked like him who's been working out for 4 or 5 years and trains on a bro split, and they look like he does, and they spend most of their time doing cable press downs and concentration curls and lat pull downs and leg extensions, and they can't squat 500 pounds, they can't rep out 315 on the bench, right? They don't deadlift 600 plus. and they've been training just fluff and pump for 4 or 5 years and they look like him, you would be able to look at that guy and say, okay, now, no, I don't think that guy's natty. And I would say that if I saw someone who looked like he does, who I know has been training that way, trains with this silly bro shit, bro pump, and has only been training 4 or 5 years, and they look like he does, I'm going to accuse that guy of being on trend, right? Because that's reasonable. But that is the problem we have. It makes it difficult for the untrained eye. The untrained eye can't discern what a natty versus not a natty even looks like anymore, because pro bodybuilding is now the standard. Oh, that's what a guy looks like who's on stuff. But that's the equivalent of saying that's what a person looks like who drinks alcohol, and the example you use is someone who drinks an entire fifth of Jack Daniels before bed every night, passes out, blacks out, and has sclerosis of the liver and is dying from it, right? That's not how we would define as, oh, we could tell that person drinks alcohol. You see the difference? And then to say that, oh, I don't think this other person drinks alcohol because they're not in the shape that they're in from it. It's that extreme. It is that extreme, because a person who drinks a couple of shots every Friday night, or has a glass of wine with their dinner every night, or a beer before bed every night, drinks alcohol. They're not drinking the amount the other guy is. That other person's putting 30, 40, 100 times as much alcohol into their system every week, right? But they both drink alcohol. Like everything else, these things, there are massively varying degrees of what people use. And professional bodybuilding represents the most ludicrous, outrageous extreme on the far end. 99% of guys who are out there doing stuff don't use the amounts that they use, and not even close. All right, guys, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.